Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this AMPO webinar. My name is Ellen Zaviska. I serve as AMPO's Transportation Planning Manager. So glad to have all of you with us today. I'm going to keep an eye on the waiting room. We've still got folks drifting in. But I will mention that this webinar is brought to you by our Transit Interest Group. That's one of our 7 interest groups here at AMPO that help us put together this webinar series and also our podcast. And we could not do this work without the volunteers from our interest group. So we very much appreciate them. And with that, I will move on to one quick housekeeping slide. Everyone's muted as you come in. I ask you to please stay on mute while the speakers are doing their thing. You are, however, welcome at any point to drop your questions or comments into the chat. We do record the meeting and we use the transcription for simply for putting together notes, and we'll share the notes and the slides afterward on our member portal. I'll share a link to where that will be later in the meeting. And just ask if you don't mind to add your organization to your Zoom handle so we know where you're joining us from. So moderating today, filling in for our leadership member who had a family emergency. Very much appreciate him joining us, is Jacob Rieger with DRCOG in Denver, where he leads the multimodal transportation planning for the Denver Regional Council of Governments. They work on regional transportation planning, multimodal projects, programs, services. They're responsible for transit, safety, freight, all sorts of great stuff. And he has 25 years of experience there. And I will pass it off to Jacob to introduce our topic and speakers for today.
Yeah, Ellen, thanks very much for the overly kind introduction. Really pleased to be here. I'm excited to moderate this session today. I think this is going to be really informative and really exciting. So today we've gathered to talk about innovative funding for transit projects. As I think most of us on this call know, MPOs play a key role in advancing transit projects that improve regional mobility. And, we're all increasingly exploring innovative funding and financing tools to complement existing sources and accelerate implementation of transit plans. So today in this webinar, you all will hear from some transit leaders across the country who are successfully leveraging these tools to deliver high impact transit investments. We'll specifically be hearing today about projects from the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and the Greater Nashville Regional Council. So we're going to get right into it. Our first presenter today is Keith Jasper with the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. Keith, I'm not going to read your bio because having my slide up, I know that can be embarrassing, and I know you want to get quite right to it. But really fortunate to have Keith here today to talk about the great work that is happening in Northern Virginia. So Keith, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And I can't help noticing how different my photograph looks to what you're seeing on camera. But heck, it's my picture and I'm going to use it. So hopefully you can see my screen. Someone can confirm that.
Yep, we see it.
Great, thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everybody, or yes, I guess it is good afternoon for most people. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of NBTA. I'm principal in charge of transportation planning and programming at NBTA, which is all I really need to say about myself. So just get into the details here. I want to cover 3 areas, just set a context for those of you who may be less familiar with our region, talk about our approach to funding transportation projects, and then some key takeaways from our experiences over the last 10 or so years since we had a revenue stream. So first up, let me say that Northern Virginia is part of the geographic footprint of the Transportation Planning Board of the National Capital Region, which is the MPO for our region, which includes the District of Columbia and suburban Maryland, as well as Northern Virginia. So in essence, NBTA is not an MPO, but we have similar functions. But for those of you not familiar, some major trip generators in Northern Virginia are listed here. Tyson's a huge, used to be Edgetown shopping mall, is now becoming a city in its own right. Numerous Fortune 500 companies, data centers, which are not necessarily major trip generators, but they are major economic generators, and so on down this list here. In terms of transportation facilities, for those of you who have flown into DC, let me tell you that if you came through Dulles or Reagan, you flew into Northern Virginia and then used some other means of transportation to get to DC. And we have a very multimodal system, including an extensive express lane or hot lane network with variable pricing, or if you have free in the vehicle, then you go free. Finally, the W&OD Trail is like a 45-mile long regional park, actually, which is a trail based on a former rail track bed, which is now a major commuting route for active transportation. The Northern Virginia Transportation Authority is comprised of 4 counties and 5 cities, and we essentially were created by the General Assembly with a couple of very specific responsibilities in mind. And these are shown by this circle in the middle we call the Circle of Life. Our long-range plan transaction, we call it, in the top half of the circle, funding programs typically referred to as a 6-year program in the bottom half of the circle. But these 2 primary responsibilities are actually integrated. So it's important to note that by state code, we can only fund projects that are in our long-range plan. And when we do fund projects, when they become fully funded, we take them out of our long-range plan, or at least move them to another part of our long-range plan. So let me turn to funding transportation projects. This is a photograph of one of MBTA's projects. This is the Potomac Yard Metro Rail Station in the city of Alexandria. And this is something that MBTA funded almost $70 million on. And we're very pleased that this is now open. It's an infill station, and quite possibly the last infill station we will see in Northern Virginia, or indeed anywhere across the DC metro region for some time, due to the funding and other constraints that the region's transportation agency is facing, as well as other operational challenges. Revenue sources are listed here. I'm not going to dwell on these too much. Some of them might be familiar to many of you. Sales tax in Northern Virginia, sales tax was 5.3% when MBTA got its funding source. That went up to by 0.7% to 6%. So that 0.7% increment comes to MBTA. Grantor's tax, which is a tax that's collected when people sell their properties. A couple of transfers from the Commonwealth, which are not particularly large sources of funding, but they have an importance, which I'll come back to at the very end of this presentation. COVA, Commonwealth of Virginia interest, is a small amount, but important that we get it. This is the interest we earn when the Commonwealth of Virginia is sitting on our money. And finally, investment portfolio earnings, which may not sound like a revenue source you typically associate with a transportation agency, more something you might associate it with, say, commercial real estate investment trusts or something like that, but I'll come back to that. However, it's collected when the revenue comes to MBTA, it's divided into regional revenues and a local distribution fund, otherwise known as 70% revenues and the 30% revenues. The 30% revenues actually have very broad applicability in transportation projects, and that's passed directly through from MBTA to our member jurisdictions for use at their discretion, providing they attest that they are using those funds in accordance with Virginia Code. And those 4 reasons or 4 types of expenditure are listed on the right-hand side of this slide. Then on the left-hand side of the slide, the regional revenues, this is what MBTA allocates through its long-range plan and 6-year program process. And so that's obviously the greatest amount of money, and particularly the Commonwealth of Virginia, when we were created and given a revenue stream, were required to give priority when we select projects that are expected to provide the greatest congestion reduction relative to the cost of the project. So to date, since we got our revenue stream, starting in fiscal year 2014, just a little over a decade ago, through the combination of our regional and local revenue distribution funds, we've invested $4.9 billion in the region, and you can see the modal breakout here. So while roadway is about half the money that's funding projects, a fairly substantial amount of money is going to transit, bike pedestrian projects, and intelligent transportation systems as well. So it's a very multimodal approach that we adopt. One caveat I'll note that with the 70% revenues, we may not fund by state code operations and maintenance. The 30% revenues can be used for operations and maintenance. I just want to mention one particular initiative that is underway at the moment and coming to the end of a public comment process, and this is a regional BRT system. MBTA has been funding BRT for some time. We're already funding all 5 of the BRT lines that are in various stages of development in Northern Virginia. What we noticed in the last update of our long-range plan, indeed the one before, is that there is a lot of high-capacity transit in our long-range plan, but our long-range plan is fiscally unconstrained. In other words, there is no financial commitment associated with our plan. But since we're already funding these projects, and since we anticipate there's quite a pipeline of potential projects coming to us for funding, we were very concerned that any expansion of BRT in Northern Virginia should kind of be guided by a blueprint, so that we can still have incremental deployment of BRT in Northern Virginia, but that we kind of have a jigsaw puzzle, and we know what the end puzzle is going to look like, even though we may be starting with 1,000 pieces and only beginning to put that together in little bits at a time. So that we have a blueprint which is going to be voted on by our authority in July, in a couple of months' time. We do see regional BRT as something that will provide a meaningful alternative for people who want to drive at the moment or have to drive at the moment, in the expectation that Metro Rail extensions are many decades in the future, and we cannot wait and do nothing or simply build more roads, widen roads in the meantime. So the BRT system that we're looking at has got 28 routes, 5 of which are those that are already underway. It's very extensive across the region. Although it might cost $4.2 billion at today's prices to construct and another $192 million a year to operate, that is a much more manageable cost than the cost of rail improvements, and indeed road improvements as well. So that's something we're looking at. If and when it's fully built out, it will look like that or something similar to that. So just quickly to wrap up, I want to talk about some key takeaways from our funding project and funding sources experiences. And I'm going to do these in 3 blocks of 3. So let me start off by talking about funding projects. MBTA funds multimodal projects to reduce congestion. That's the reason we were created by the General Assembly. But although we were created to solve a roadway congestion problem, we were not constrained as to how we fund projects, which meant that we were able to fund a variety of projects to address a congestion problem. And as the slides I showed you previously have indicated, we have been fairly successful in doing that. NVDA can only fund the projects that are in transaction, and the fact that our long-range plan transaction is tied into our funding process, we find very valuable. It means that even though the projects in a long-range plan may be 20 or 25 years away, as soon as that long-range plan is adopted, all those projects in the long-range plan become eligible for funding through the next 6-year program cycle. And we find that really focuses the mind, ours and our member jurisdictions. And the third point in this slide is that we have found that our funds can leverage funds from multiple other sources. And one example I give you for the Richmond Highway BRT in Fairfax County in our region, which NVDA is putting $330 million into. Fairfax County, the jurisdiction for which it passes, has successfully kind of gone through the FDA's Capital Investment Grant Program and is on track to secure over $300 million from FTA as well. Next, I want to talk about our process, as it were. We found from the get-go, as a new transportation agency with a new funding stream, that visibility into what we're doing, transparency and accountability were absolutely essential for elected officials and others. We created an IT-based system to be able to, for eligible applicants to be able to submit their applications, for projects that are approved to go through a project agreement process, submit their reimbursement request to us, and with all that data to create a public-facing dashboard so that in real time, every time we pay an invoice, that dashboard is updated, members of the public can see what we're doing. Funding projects on a reimbursement basis incentivizes project delivery. Think about it from the project sponsor's point of view. They get paid when the project advances. So we don't write checks for grants. We pay when there's actual progress, demonstrable progress on the projects. That's really important in combination with a variety of carrots and sticks to keep project delivery moving along. That works really well for us. The other thing it also does, it means that the funds stay with us until they're drawn down for a project. And I'll come back to that in the next slide. Third on this slide, NVDA has a unique, I think, unique mandate to equalize long-term benefit. And essentially what this means is when we were created, or when our funding stream was created, the General Assembly said that over the long term, our member jurisdictions had to receive a benefit that was approximately equal to the share of revenues that are attributed to those localities. And that basically means that the money over the long term does get spread across the region. So, if jurisdiction A is generating 50% of our revenues, then jurisdiction A will get approximately 50% of the benefit of the investments that we make. And finally, when it comes to revenues, there's no other way to look at this. Sales tax is a reliable and resilient revenue source. It's reliable because it shows steady growth over time. It's resilient because we're going through high inflation now. We've been through COVID, and the sales tax revenues in Northern Virginia just keep going up. And as they go up, we get that 0.7% comes back to us. So that is a really amazing revenue source for us. Operating on a reimbursement basis has multiple advantages. Kind of touched on this already. One of the things which comes out of this, because we keep the revenue before it's needed, we actually have a very large investment program, which basically means we continue to earn money, our money we've already received, until it's actually needed to pay an invoice. This started off small, it's actually grown big, and in the current fiscal year, we're on track to secure somewhere between $80 and $85 million in earnings from our investment portfolio, which is money that will all go back into projects in Northern Virginia. And finally, and perhaps more on a down note, what the General Assembly giveth, the General Assembly can take away. And we experienced this in 2018 when some of our revenues were diverted to serve another urgent transportation need in Northern Virginia. Since that time, I mentioned earlier on an earlier slide, a couple of transfers were created to begin to backfill that money for MBTA. We're not quite whole yet, but it was a fairly solid reminder in 2018 that because MBTA doesn't have the authority to actually set the tax rates, the body that does, the General Assembly, can add to them and they can take them away. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention. QR code takes you to our social media contacts if you need any more information, but happy to take any questions if there are any.
Yeah, Keith, thank you very much. What a great presentation. Thank you so much. We do have time for a couple of questions now. I do see a question in the chat from Michael Greenwald. Michael, I'd invite you to just ask your question directly.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I guess basically one of the things I saw and compared to my own jurisdiction, the contrast that I noted is it appears that if I'm understanding correctly, I think NVTA, your jurisdiction is sufficiently large that your transit agencies would be direct recipient of their FTA funding. And if that assumption is correct, that would suggest that those transit agencies get their own capital and operations funding off of the 5307, 5309, 5339 programs. Assuming that that's a correct description of your situation, how does that fact influence your planning and execution of anything with multi-jurisdictional BRT systems? Or is this simply a non-issue because you're serving the capital, and as we all know, DC gets special methods, special exemptions a lot of the times from special consideration from other rules. I hope I explained that correctly or sufficiently well.
I think so. Certainly, Washington Metro Transportation Authority gets some funding sources which are probably somewhat unique to it. But our local transit agencies, I'm not sure to what extent they get those federal sources in this region. Certainly, both at the DC Metro region level and statewide in Virginia, there are a couple of initiatives underway right now to look into dedicated funding for transit, both capital and operating. So whatever they're getting at the moment, they're not getting enough. I think there was a lot of COVID funds that were used to kind of tide them over that period, but those funds are largely exhausted. And there's a new reality where, for a while at least, ridership was very down. In our region, ridership is coming out very strongly, particularly on bus. It's getting there on rail, which has helped fill some gaps through direct revenue from passengers to fill up some of the operational funding gaps. With our BRT blueprint for Northern Virginia, we see a high operating cost impact, but we're not yet far enough advanced into the work to be able to say, we know we won't be able to fund that, but we're not yet in a position to know whether there will be an increased demand for funding for transit operations, or whether what currently exists can be repurposed for if you like, a redesigned transit system across the region. So I'm not sure I can really give a very definitive answer to that. The one final thing I would say, though, is when when jurisdictions, project sponsors submit funding requests to us for the sorts of projects that we can legally fund, they are required to check a box in the application that says if funding is approved for this project, you're aware and will meet all the operational costs associated with this project. So, I mean, I think there's a clear division that MBTA cannot do it all, but MBTA does provide enormous financial capacity for infrastructure and rolling stock and so on, and that perhaps enables local jurisdictions and other bodies to repurpose funds to cover more operations and maintenance.
Thank you, that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Michael and Keith. I think we've got time for at least one more question. So I don't see any other questions yet in the chat. So I'll open it up just to the group and ask if what other questions folks might have. I don't think I see any hands raised yet. Keith, I have a question for you. I think you touched on this at the very beginning, but if you could elaborate just a little bit, what is your agency's MBTA, your agency's relationship with your MPO just from a planning process perspective, right? Because you share territory. How does that work from a planning and a project selection, a funding perspective?
Yeah, it's very collaborative, I would say, first of all. You know, like many of you, you probably have staff level coordinating committees. We certainly do. Transportation Planning Board, TPB, the MPO has, and we each send staff to each other's coordinating committees and so on. So at the staff level, it's very well connected. Quite a number of members of MBTA are also members of either the Transportation Planning Board directly or the Metropolitan Washington Council of Government, where TPB is kind of housed, as it were. So at the political level, there's quite a bit of integration as well. We each have, TPB has, responsibilities, that are driven more from federal regulations perspective. There are no federal dollars coming into MBTA directly. We are somewhat involved in CMAQ and RSTP program funding recommendations, but the decision-making authority for that is with the Commonwealth of Virginia in our case. So I think we're like-minded, but the key difference is that MBTA was created for a specific purpose. TPB was created as an MPO for a specific purpose, and there are some differences, that are kind of legally based that affects the way we go about doing things. But I think in terms of our transportation planning approach, I think we see things pretty similarly.
Right. Keith, again, thank you so much for your great presentation. Interest of time, I do want to shift us to our second speaker today and leave some time at the end for questions, both for our second speaker and for overall. So our second and last speaker today is Michael Skipper from the Nashville region. Again, Michael, I'm not going to read your bio, but really pleased to have you here today representing the Nashville MPO and the great work that you're doing in Nashville. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Thursday. I'm Michael Skipper with the Greater Nashville Regional Council, and I am going to get my screen shared here in a bit.
And Michael, while you're getting your presentation up, just a friendly reminder to everyone, if you do have questions for either speaker, please feel free to populate them in the chat and we will get to those. And also we'll have a chance at the end for questions too.
Perfect. Thanks for stretching there a little bit, Jacob.
Yep.
Well, thank you to you and Keith. I really appreciate your perspective on the implementation side. And Ellen, thank you for the invitation today from AMPA to be part of this. I've been involved in AMPA for 20 or so years, but it's been some time since I've personally attended the event. So it's really good to be online with everybody today. Jacob, are you seeing a full screen on the slides?
Yes, I am.
Perfect. All right. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit from Keith's presentation and kind of share the NPO perspective from our area in terms of what we're doing to advance funding for public transit in our region. I've got 3 parts to my presentation as well. Talk a little bit about GNRC in our regional context, particularly the NPO program. Then I'll zoom in, talk a little bit about the IMPROVE Act, the Tennessee IMPROVE Act that was passed by our legislature, signed by the governor into law in 2017, which had really 2 critical components to funding transportation. One of those being dedicated funding for transit. And then I will share with you some of the work that Metro Nashville, our local government, who is implementing the first success out of that enabling legislation, what they intend to be implementing over the next 15 years. So that is a look at my run of show. I'll get into it. So GNRC, the Greater Nashville Regional Council, is one of 9 development districts across Tennessee. So we're a comprehensive council of governments. We serve Northern Middle Tennessee, the Nashville metropolitan area, plus handful of other counties that are include Clarksville, Murfreesboro, which are relatively large cities here in Tennessee, but a lot of rural areas as well across Middle Tennessee. We call ourselves a development district, but it's an interchangeable term with Council of Governments. And we are now a comprehensive COG, which is relatively new for us. Before joining GNRC in 2016, I managed the Nashville area NPO when it was housed within our local government. We were a 5-county NPO, 7-county NPO, but we were housed within our largest local government in 2016. Took this job at GNRC on the pitch to integrate the NPO program into the Council of Governments, which was already designated as the Federal Economic Development District by Department of Commerce. We also serve as the Area Agency on Aging here for Middle Tennessee. That's a designation by HHS and our State Unit on Aging. So we've really worked very hard to integrate a lot of the regional planning that influences community design and investment strategies across Middle Tennessee. So that NPO integration into the COG is very much part of our overall strategy to advance, better investments in public transit across Middle Tennessee. A little bit about our regional population trends. This is probably familiar to many of the NPOs on the call today. We've seen significant growth in the last couple of decades. We're at about 100 people per day increase in population within our counties over the last 15 years or so. And our planning horizon of 2045, which is associated with the transportation plan that I'll talk about today, has us exceeding 3 million as a region by 2045. And then you see there the comparison to present day populations of some of our peer regions across the nation. So significant growth. As far as the metropolitan area, I mentioned we're designated as an NPO, but our geography actually spans, our Council of Government geography actually spans 2 NPOs and 2 rural planning organizations. We staff and administer the larger NPO, the Nashville area NPO, and then we staff the communities in the other NPO and the other RPOs for economic development and social services work, but then otherwise just coordinate our transportation planning with those other organizations. So I'm going to kind of zoom in for most of my talk here on the footprint of the Nashville area NPO, which is a subset of our COG geography. And you can see there the urban areas across the state of Tennessee per the 2010 census designations. And so our NPO area is 7 counties here around the Nashville area. Like many of you, we forecast a pretty significant growth. So of the 3.2 million people across the mid-state that we expect up by 2045, the majority of those are expected to land within the metropolitan footprint of Nashville and its surrounding counties. And with that obviously comes increased traffic congestion. We are forecasting a doubling of the amount of time that we spend in congested conditions, 14% decline in average travel speeds. And the congestion maps really open people's eyes, not just to the worsening severity of congestion on routes that are already congested, but just the expansion of the network that will be in a congested condition in the future. And so most folks in Middle Tennessee, their congestion management strategy is just to avoid a congested route today. And that becomes less of an option into the future as that footprint of congested corridors expand. So that's pretty eye-opening to our policymakers here locally, trying to in terms of getting them to realize that, you know, congestion is part of our future. It's going to get worse in terms of its spread geographically. And we need a better focus on making sure that we're providing options that allow people to avoid being held hostage by that congestion. Like many of you across the US, as you see increases in active transportation happening, particularly during and post-pandemic, as people were getting out and active, we've experienced the 5 years leading up to the adoption of our last plan, saw a 76% increase in pedestrian fatalities. And so a lot of our policy making is you know, transcends the traffic congestion issues, really about making sure people are safe traveling our roads. The current plan we adopted back in 2021 extends the year 2045. You are all MPOs, you know, it goes into these RTPs. I think the takeaway here is that our fiscally constrained portion of our plan had about $10.5 billion of revenue. And if you're interested in the plan, gnrc.org/RTP can get you to the interactive documents and maps if for some reason you're interested in where our investments are going across the network. But some key takeaways from our fiscally constrained plan are that of the $10.5 billion that we have identified for the 25-year planning horizon, about 35% of that is set aside for programmatic investments. That includes HSIP and CMAQ, you know, programmatic investments out of the federal government, but also includes our SDBG funds that are suballocated to our region. Back in 2010, we established a policy that rakes 30% of our suballocated SDBG off the top and sets it aside for non-capacity improvements and multimodal infrastructure and technology. So we've very successful about 15 years ago getting our mayors and broader set of elected officials to buy into investing beyond roadway widening projects from a regional perspective. Another key takeaway from our current plan, though, is that of the 65% of the funding that is being itemized and allocated to specific roadway investments across our area, half of that money is going to projects that have been in the pipeline for 10, 15, 20 years. And so the plan really isn't moving the needle in terms of bringing in those new starts that are really more forward-looking. Also significant is 72% of the funding is going to projects that are identified in the IMPROVE Act, which I'll talk about in Act 2 of the presentation today. And that's pretty significant too. So bottom line here, $10.5 billion fiscally constrained plan, vast majority of that going to commitments that have been on the table, you know, ideated, you know, a few decades ago. I know this next slide is a lot to take in. I think what I want to draw your attention to is that of the $10.5 billion, only about $1 billion of that was dedicated to supporting the expansion of local and regional transit. Our RTP is largely driven by the federal program that brings along the state and local matching dollars. And much of that is just, again, it's being spent based on inertia and momentum. And we do the best we can to work with our policy board to find opportunities to get that money flexed to transit projects. But here we're at, you know, roughly 10% of our overall spending being dedicated to our transit system in terms of modernization and expansion. The other thing that pretty eye-opening when we look at the performance of the investments that are identified in the transportation plan, they do achieve an increase in travel speeds across the region. So baseline was projecting a 14% decline in overall speeds on the network out to the year 2045. With the $10.5 billion of investment, we get that to be 3% better. But maybe more troubling is this next performance measure, in that even after all that spending, we're actually making the amount of travel that's happening in congestion 12% worse from where we are today in terms of the E+C network projected out to the year 2045. And many of you have been doing transportation planning for a long time, know that that's just a result of induced demand that's brought on by the capacity improvements that we're making in congested areas already. And so the models don't look fondly on the capacity improvements that we're making on the roadway side when it comes to alleviating the experience that people are having today sitting in congestion. So again, this just reinforces the policy narrative around making sure that as we continue to update these plans, that we're doing what we can to free people from being held hostage by the congestion that we know will be around our metro area for some time into the future. We also, I want to, again, I'm really setting up the reason why we've been going hard at dedicated funding for transit here. So as I begin to segue here, I want to show y'all the benchmarks for our $10.5 billion RTP against the peers that we track ourselves against. And I mean, we're not in the ballpark against our peers when it comes to the amount of funding that's identified in the fiscally constrained portion of our plan. In fact, we're 6-to-1 being outspent per capita by the Denver region, 3-to-1 by Atlanta Metro, and 2-to-1 by Austin. And when we look at the reasons why we're underinvesting in transportation, at least from the fiscally constrained part of the plan, it's often what is easy to see is that the missing ingredient for our region has been dedicated funding to transportation from the local level. And then by extension, the loss of opportunity to draw down additional discretionary grants to invest in our large capital projects to improve public transit. So it's that dedicated funding piece, and then the leveraging of the discretionary grants that really tell the story of why we're so far behind in terms of level of investment into transportation. So for years now, we've convened the mayors of Middle Tennessee who obviously serve on the regional council. They serve as the voting members of our transportation policy board, but we also convened them in a more informal setting. Back in 2008, we established a mayor's caucus, which is more about relationship building and shared learning, agenda setting, no real authority as a group. It's more of a fellowship, exchange of ideas. But from time to time, they do find consensus and get really motivated to act through other entities, maybe GNRC, maybe the MPO program, but it's really just about moving the needle for Middle Tennessee. We've had a couple of goes at the Tennessee State Legislature with respect to funding for transportation. Back in 2009, we drafted a revision to the statute that enables the creation of regional transportation authorities, or really regional transit authorities across Middle Tennessee. Made a lot of reforms back in 2009, which was an early legislative victory in otherwise conservative state here in Tennessee, but a victory for public transit. It created some opportunities to pursue dedicated funding, but fell short of empowering individual governments or a regional authority to directly ask voters for direct taxing authority for dedication to public transit. It had some framework that was useful, but fell short of that. And so fast forward to 2016, it became clear that the state of Tennessee itself was beginning to find the support to increase the state gas tax. And so we approached the governor's administration, governor's staff and the administration at the time about tag teaming on, in exchange for our support to help them with increase to the state gas tax. To get their buy-in to include a provision that would empower local governments to go to the voters for approval for dedicated funding for public transit. So we're in Music City. We're not just known for the musicians here, but we've been most maybe infamously known from a transportation standpoint as one of the largest metros without dedicated funding for public transit in America. And so 2017 was the beginning of the end of that claim to fame. So in 2017, the bill was signed into law. It did several different things. It increased the state gas tax, diesel tax, the CNG tax, the liquefied gas tax. The headliner here is that we increased our state gas tax from 20 cents per gallon to 26 cents per gallon. The unfortunate thing about that gas tax increase, though, if you recall the slide I had earlier where I mentioned that 70+% of our funding going to itemized projects, we're going to improve act projects. In exchange for getting the legislature to buy into the gas tax increase, we ended up codifying a project list with it. And I don't think if you ask most mayors across our area today, they'd argue that those were sort of backwards looking old projects that we've kind of moved on from, but now they're part of the code. And the 6 cent increase isn't directly tied to those projects, but our Department of Transportation is statutorily required to deliver those projects under state law. And so that's really eating up the majority of our state gas tax increase. and then a lot more than that. It also increased the electric vehicle registration fee to $100 per year from, I think the base is around $30 a year for other cars. It decreased the sales tax on food, so the governor put in offsets for the increase in transportation funding to get political support for the bill. But what we're really interested in is that it created, for the first time ever, authority for local governments to pursue dedicated funding for public transit. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then in terms of this, where you can find more information about the Improve Act, the slides will, as you get those and you're interested, we've provided links to the code and some of the fact sheets around that bill. So as far as the local option funding for transit, so our role as an MPO was to convene our local partners, our local policymakers, and we took the lead on this bill in terms of framing out the local option provision. We framed it out and we drafted most of the language that ended up getting approved by the General Assembly. And what we ended up doing is essentially, I had spent some time in Florida as a professional before coming back to Nashville in 2007 and was familiar with the transit surcharge that was available to counties there. So we modeled our legislation off of that idea. And so what we proposed to the legislature was to allow cities and counties to add a surcharge or surtax to any existing local tax that was already being levied. So you couldn't create a local option transit tax by implementing the base tax. You had to have that base tax already implemented. And so we get to choose from a menu of existing local taxes to add a local surtax onto, and those include sales tax, hotel motel tax. You can see the list there. What's not included, property tax, and we are not a state income tax. We do not have income taxes in the state of Tennessee. We had a little bit of income tax on capital gains that was repealed actually with the Improve Act, but largely we're a sales tax focused state, which is obviously got its disadvantages in terms of it being regressive. And so what we do with this money that's generated from the surtax, if it were to come from sales tax, is just to make sure that it's disproportionately benefiting those who are being impacted the most by that approach to taxation. We can use this money, if it's approved by the voters, to improve any part of the public transportation system. So this is not just directly transit routes and transit vehicles, rolling stock and the like, but it's any aspect of the transportation infrastructure on a route served by transit. And so you'll see in terms of what Nashville chose to, how they chose to guide their surtax revenue, you'll see that they're paying for more parts of the transportation system than transit as a way to improve the conditions within which transit is operating. In order to pursue the tax or surtax, you've got to develop a transit improvement program, which is lovely that it shares the same acronym with our transportation improvement programs, if it wasn't already confusing enough. But we develop a TIP for the surtax, which is fiscally constrained, that has to then be reviewed and certified by the state comptroller. So there's a lot of certainty in the financial assumptions before it goes to the ballot. And then if approved by the voters, gets implemented. The surtax is only available to cities over 165,000 in population as of 2010, and counties of 112,000 in population. So it wasn't universally available to communities across Middle Tennessee. The focus really was on communities that had transit systems that operated within our regional transportation authority areas across the state of Tennessee. So a little bit about how, so Nashville actually attempted to get voter approval for the surtax. They had proposed a combination of surtaxes through our first go around through the ballot box a few years ago that failed. And then so we tried again in recently and just focused on the sales tax. And so the proposal here was a 0.5-cent surcharge on the local sales tax. It was approved by voters in November of this year. You can find more details about the program at transit.nashville.gov. One thing I'll mention though is the surtax in Tennessee, the local option sales tax, like just the base sales tax, is limited to 2 3/4%. So 2.75 cents on the dollar is the maximum a local government can charge in the form of sales tax. the surtax cap is the same. So the surtax with the surtax, you can go an additional 2.75% in terms of taxing capacity. So the surtax is not limited by the caps that are imposed on the base tax, which was a really nice part of the legislation that we were able to get through. So it created a lot more capacity for revenue generation for us here in Middle Tennessee. So in terms of how Nashville, Davidson County, which is a consolidated government, is choosing to use the half-cent sales tax surcharge for the transit program, they focused on sidewalks, signals, transit service, and safety. And I'll run you through this here. You'll learn more from exploring it on your own. But what was key to this, though, was that Metro Nashville was very coordinated with us here at the NPO and was very much aligned with our adopted transportation plan and took a lot of the recommendations that had been produced out of the regional studies that we had developed over the last couple of decades to form that transit improvement program in the first place. Our initiative at the ballot box this time around was less focused on community engagement for the purposes of project ideation and more on making sure people understood the degree to which planning had been happening for the last couple of decades and the long list of projects that had been identified but had remained unfunded. And so we really streamlined community engagement because of the planning that the NPO and its partners have been doing over the last 20 years. 86 miles of sidewalks are expected to be improved through the surtax over the next 15 years. Most of the sidewalk investments will be made on the first part of that timeline. 86 miles of sidewalks doesn't sound like a lot, but the city had constructed 6.5 miles of sidewalks in the year prior to the ballot initiative. So this really does expand the sidewalk improvement program across the county to lay the groundwork for increased levels of service on the transit system. It also proposed to upgrade nearly 600 traffic signals across the county. 2/3 of the signals will be touched by the revenue from the half-cent sales tax surcharge. And then immediate increases in frequencies, but also long-term capital investments included in the plan was 54 miles of all access corridors, which are essentially we're striving for dedicated lane BRT on complete street corridors, just completely rebuilding the right of way to include dedicated lane transit, and then looking for opportunities to upgrade those potentially to light rail should the federal funds become available as we go through the planning and engineering process. Also included the construction of 12 transit centers and 17 park and ride lots. And then a lot of investments in improving roadway safety for transit users and non-users, including bus stop upgrades, intersection realignments, and protected bikeways across the county. In terms of the financial impact to the average voter, the half-cent sales tax is essentially, a quarter per every $50 spent. This half-cent in Davidson County generates roughly $150 million a year, which I think is where I'll end and open up for questions. So going back to that $10.5 billion fiscally constrained plan and how far behind it was compared to our peers. The $150 million that we're going to be getting annually from the surcharge is a 60% increase in the revenue associated with our fiscally constrained plan. So this is going to be a huge improvement in what we're able to do to deliver transportation benefits to Middle Tennesseans for the next 15 years. The tax doesn't on its own expire, but the construction program associated with this initiative should be completed ideally within a 15-year period. And so it's very likely this is just the first of what will be a series of dedicated funding pushes over the next couple of decades. So with that, Jacob, I'll turn it back over to you for any questions that folks in the room might have.
Yeah, Michael, thanks very much for really informative and great presentation. We do have one question in the chat from Deborah Reardon, and Deborah, I'd invite you to ask your question directly.
Yeah, hi everyone. This is Deb Reardon with the Regional Transportation Commission of Southern Nevada. We serve as the MPO for the Las Vegas metro area. We're also the transit agency, and like Nashville, we're one of the large metros in the country that does not have a state dedicated funding source. I I just had a question around the funding that you have generated. Is that mostly used for operations, or are you also using that for capital, like bus purchases and things?
Yeah, so up to this point, all of our local investments in the transit were general fund contributions. And so most of that was focused on operations and then match for capital investments. With the new program that was just approved by the voters that would generate 150 million a year, most of that is for service expansions. So operations, but expansions on the existing operations. There was no supplanting of the previous contributions from the general fund. So those are being maintained. And so this is all an incremental investment in operations. But really, the intent of the dedicated funding was to build new things and then have the funding to operate that into the future.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great, thanks for your question, Deborah. I don't see any other questions in the chat at the moment, so I do want to open it up just to general audience and see if there are other questions that folks may have. All right, I don't think I'm seeing any hands raised. Ellen, do you think in our couple minutes left that we've got time for a quick poll?
Or would you like me to launch that, Jacob?
Yes, although I did just see, Deborah, it looks like you had another question.
Yeah, sorry. If there's time, I was just curious about the public engagement process and kind of how Nashville went about building community support to pass that tax, especially in 24.
I think a lot of the reason for success in 2024, and so that initiative passed with that 66%, so 2/3 of voters supported it, which is fantastic. But a lot of that was built upon the failed referendum of a few years before that. A lot of people were defeated, personally defeated and deflated from that loss. But part of the one of the roles of the NPO is try to keep people optimistic and get them to understand, like as we look across the country, that initial failure is often the price you have to pay to get people to begin paying attention to the need for their participation and funding to deliver the things that they're expecting from us. And so I think a lot of the reasons for success with the passage here was that early failure. I think the other thing that was beneficial for us here is just the simplification of the approach to funding. I mentioned that earlier initiative tried to cobble together multiple taxes for the surcharge to be applied, and it was well intended. It was intended basically to show equity and who was contributing to the funding program. But in the end, it created enemies where you didn't need to create them and confused people on how it all worked. So the simplification on the message around where the funding was coming from, 60% or so of our sales tax revenue in Davidson County is paid for by people who do not live in Davidson County. And being in Nevada, you probably have a similar ratio, which is very beneficial from a marketing standpoint. And then the other thing is that this package of projects was very reasonable in terms of being things that we knew we needed, whereas the last time around we did have more focus on light rail and even included a project that would have constructed a tunnel under downtown, like projects that are necessary for the long term, but difficult for people to buy into, going from 0 to 60, overnight.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we are just about at time, so I want to thank both of our speakers, Michael Skipper again from the Greater Nashville region, and Keith Jasper from Northern Virginia. Thank you so much for your presentations. Ellen has put a couple notes in the chat regarding next steps. So Ellen, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Really appreciate you stepping up to excellently moderate this webinar. I'll share my thanks also with Keith and Michael for their presentations, really informative. And finally, I'll thank everyone for joining us for this webinar. We really appreciate the turnout, appreciate the interest in this new interest group, and hope to see you at another one of our webinars very soon down the road. Take care, everyone.